Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hello, Mouin. Good to see you again.
Hello, Nasim. It's always a pleasure to be with you. How are you?
Not bad. I hope you've recovered from your journey back from Qatar. I think you were in last week.
Yes.
So, as many would have guessed, our main focus this week will be the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah by Israel. Um, this event, which occurred last Friday, is the latest in a long, continuous, I would say, history of targeted assassination carried out by Israel since its founding in 1948. Hassan Nasrallah is just one of many. His predecessor, Abbas Musawi, was also assassinated back in 1992. And one of the questions we'll be asking is, why does Israel constantly feel the need to assassinate its enemies? And has it made Israel safer? Has it made Israel any more legitimate? Is Israel in a better position than it was um, in the 50s or 60s, despite the constant assassinations and the occupations and the apartheid that we see in Palestine currently? But before we get to all that, I want to just first begin with Moin's initial thoughts on the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. So over to you, Moin.
Well, I think this would have been a huge development on its own under any circumstances. But I think we have to also look at it in its broader context, by which I mean it was not just the assassination of the longtime General Secretary rather, of Hezbollah, but it took place in the context in which numerous senior Hezbollah military commanders had been assassinated during the past 2 months, many of them in the space of 2 weeks, and took place as kind of the climax of a campaign of state terror and assassination. You know, the pager and walkie-talkie attacks, the massive bombings of southern Lebanon and the southern suburbs of Beirut, and so on. And I think it's pretty clear now that Israel is on a campaign not just to de-link Lebanon from Gaza, not just to seek to deal a mortal blow to Hezbollah, but to redraw the strategic map of the Middle East. In other words, I think Israel's objectives now are to dismantle the self-styled axis of resistance piece by piece. This involves dealing comprehensively with Hezbollah, expelling Iranian forces from Syria, of course, crushing Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and I think ultimately seeking to provoke a direct military confrontation with Iran that will be fought primarily by the United States. All of this, of course, taking place in the context of a U.S. presidency that is unconditionally supportive of Israel, that I think has changed its stance from one that will not do anything to restrain Israel to one that now openly shares the fulfillment of its agenda, and in a context in which Israel, I think, is also acting to meet two more narrow political objectives. One is to strengthen Netanyahu's position within the Israeli political arena, and the second is to increase the electoral appeal, if you will, of Donald Trump in the US election campaign.
Hmm. And you mentioned at the beginning that this is probably a new front where Israel is seeking to take out and dismantle the entire axis of resistance, as it's known. Then I go back to my initial statement, which is that Israel has been trying to kill its way out of its situation of constant occupation and ethnic cleansing. And that's why it's not been successful. If anything, many would say Israel is even more insecure because of its occupation. Hezbollah came out as a result of its occupation, Hamas is a result of its occupation, and it has assassinated many, many leaders. And none of those assassinations has brought Israel any closer to security or international legitimacy. So why would it be any different now? If anything, the argument, history will suggest that the argument is that after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, they may appoint someone who is even more shrewd, even more extreme, if you want to put it that way, than Hassan Nasrallah.
Well, I think there's several reasons. I think first, if you just look at it in, let's say, conventional military terms, obviously, if you're able to assassinate the commanders and leaders of your enemy, that's not going to hurt. And I think what Israel has been doing during the past 2 months, and particularly the past 2 weeks, is to demonstrate to Hezbollah how deeply it is penetrated, or at least how easily Israel can locate its commanders, to throw them kind of into organizational disarray and chaos. In large part, I think, to prepare for the next step, which is going to be an attempt to deal a massive blow against the movement and its cadres and its capabilities within Lebanon, again, in order to eliminate it. So I think there is, at one level, let's say, a conventional military explanation for what Israel is doing, particularly when you're talking about someone like the Hezbollah General Secretary Hassan Nasrallah, who was not only revered within his movement, but had become a regional actor, very charismatic, iconic leader, who, particularly after the assassination the of General Qasem Soleimani of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in 2020. After that, even more than before, Nasrallah became the very personification of the axis of resistance. But I think, specifically relating to your question, there's also another explanation, which is that Israel, along, I think, with many in the West generally, tend to look at peoples in the third world as sheep, people who do not have political motivations of their own, people who either have no legitimate grievances or don't understand that they have legitimate grievances, and therefore people who are being exploited and incited to further the radical agendas of organizations like, previously it was Fatah and the PFLP. Today it is Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. And so it becomes kind of a personification of the war, if you will, that you have all these Palestinians, all these Shiites, all these Lebanese, all these whatever, who don't even understand that they have legitimate grievances, who under normal circumstances would happily accept reality as it is and certainly not take up arms against anyone. And that the reason they're mobilized and the reason they're fighting is because they're being incited by these nefarious characters, whether it was Jamal Abdel Nasser or Yasser Arafat, or now Yahya Sinwar and Nasrallah and others. So it fits into, I think, a general idea where if you can only get rid of this leader who is inciting them, the sheep will return to pasture and happily just forage their way around and not bother anyone anymore. I really do think this kind of, deeply held racist conviction about the people of the Middle East is an important part of the explanation.
So where do you think this leaves Gaza? I think do you think Israelis believe that they've ended this part of their campaign, and now we know troops are being amassed on southern Lebanon, northern Israel, likely for some kind of a ground invasion? It's yet to be established how Israel can actually neutralize or eliminate Hezbollah without actually occupying Lebanon and without a full ground invasion. And if that were the case, and we've seen how Israel has performed in Gaza, where Hamas, everyone will say, is as not as formidable as Hezbollah. And despite that, Israel, of course, has scored minor tactical victories, but it's not really changed the whole structure of the conflict. Israel has become more of a pariah in the international arena, which is more of, I would say, a strategic threat to Israel than minor victories against Hamas, minor victories against Hezbollah. So are we seeing um, the Gaza chapter of its war end with a complete focus on Hezbollah? Will Israel be forced to launch a ground invasion if it is to eradicate Hezbollah? And as I said, I mean, how is it possible to eradicate Hezbollah without a ground invasion?
Well, there's several questions there. The first one I would respond by saying ultimately this is all about Palestine, much more than it is about Lebanon or Hezbollah or Iran or anything else. Secondly, it's not as if Israel has withdrawn from the Gaza Strip and focused entirely on Lebanon. Its genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip continues apace every hour of every day, and there were numerous bombings and several massacres in the central and southern regions of the Gaza Strip yesterday. You're right that if you look at the Gaza Strip, Israel has failed to eradicate Hamas, but it has, I think, largely succeeded in ensuring that the Gaza Strip is uninhabitable for human life. And that, I think, was always one of its main objectives. Another point to make is that now, with all the focus on Lebanon, and I'm not saying that that focus is in any way illegitimate, given what Israel is visiting upon that country, but we're not talking about the Gaza Strip anymore. We're not talking about the West Bank anymore. And should this escalate into a full scale regional war, even beyond what we're already seeing, um, no one will be asking Israel what it's doing in the Gaza. I mean, assuming that to some extent they are. And that raises real alarm, I think, about Israel intensifying its genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip even much further than it already has, and at the same time to take drastic measures to unilaterally reach its end state of annexation in the West Bank, and perhaps even under cover of a regional war, begin with expulsions of the population of the West Bank. So if you accept that ultimately this is all about an effort by Israel to unilaterally determine what's called the final status of Palestine, um, uh, this serves that Israeli agenda. Now, the last part of your question concerning Lebanon, you're right. Hezbollah cannot be destroyed by intelligence operations and assassinations and saturation bombing. To eliminate Hezbollah would take a large scale Israeli land invasion of Lebanon in order to dismantle this organization piece by piece. We have seen multiple indications that Israeli raids into Lebanon may have already started, and that their purpose is to prepare the ground for a ground invasion, whether directly into Lebanon, into eastern Lebanon, through Syria, or a combination of both, or perhaps even from elsewhere. But this is much easier said than done. Hezbollah is much more deeply entrenched, a much more capable and a much larger force than Hamas is. And if you look at the difficulties that the Israeli military is experiencing in the Gaza Strip, I suspect it's going to, despite what clearly is a very thorough intelligence picture that it has of Lebanon, I think it's going to encounter much more significant challenges in Lebanon.
Yeah, and talking about response by Hezbollah, I mean, how may they respond? Well, first of all, I guess a lot depends on who is selected to replace Hassan Nasrallah. I mean, two names have been mentioned, Hashim Safeddin and Naim Qasim, I think. And can they respond now? I mean, everything I'm reading at the moment suggests that Israel and everything that's happened over the past 2 weeks suggests that Israel has fully penetrated Hezbollah's communication. If that really is the case, can Hezbollah risk a full a response that is, a kind of response that would merit an assassination of their leader? Yeah, so two questions. What kind of response can we expect? And also, can they respond given, as I said, um, the reports are that Israel has penetrated Hezbollah's communication?
Well, it's quite clear, I think, that since 2006, Israel has managed to collect massive amounts of intelligence on Hezbollah. And some analysts have suggested that Hezbollah, which traditionally was a very clandestine, very tightly knit group, had to kind of emerge into the open when it took the decision to intervene in the Syrian civil war, and that this created numerous additional opportunities for Israel to get a better picture of the organization, of its personnel, and so on. In addition, of course, to deploying the full might of its intelligence capabilities against Hezbollah. And I would add to this that, as some have noted, Israel is, for all intents and purposes, the sixth member of the Five Eyes intelligence groupings, which brings together the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And it has access to virtually all of the raw intelligence produced by this grouping. And so Hezbollah has been under Hezbollah, and for that matter, every square millimeter of Lebanon has been under 24/7 intelligence monitoring by the most powerful intelligence agencies in human history for many years. Nevertheless, even taking into account the points you made, Hezbollah remains a very capable organization. Yes, it is in disarray. Yes, it has been thrown off balance. Yes, it has lost many senior commanders. But I think we need to look at Hezbollah not just as an armed movement or a non-state actor, but also as a deeply institutionalized movement, which has, over the years, I think, prepared for these kinds of scenarios about expecting that there will be leadership vacuums and so on, and therefore has also decentralized to a significant extent. I don't in any way want to minimize Israel's successes or the very serious blows that Hezbollah has had to absorb over the past month or two. But to suggest that this is a fatal blow and that this represents a strategic turning point rather than a significant tactical defeat, I think is very premature. And last part of your question, I think Hezbollah is now facing a moment of truth. If it capitulates and accepts or is forced to renounce its support for the Gaza Strip, or if it either chooses not to or proves incapable of responding forcefully to this latest Israeli campaign, it will I think it will be in a very severe crisis, orders of magnitude more severe than that which it is now facing, because its whole principle that it had established a balance of deterrence with Israel, that it is capable of protecting not only its constituency and its supporters, but also Lebanon, that will evaporate. into thin air. And I think that Hezbollah recognizes this. I certainly wouldn't have expected them to immediately hit back with everything they have, because they need to take stock of of the problems in their own organization. They need to get a better understanding of how they were so exposed and so vulnerable. And I think it's one of these hallmarks of Hezbollah over the years, that it is not an impulsive organization, that it responds and acts shrewdly and strategically, as you said. And I think it will now be judged by its capacity, by its capability to continue or fail to operate in this way.
Before we move to some of the other questions I had in mind regarding Washington and also Iran and a couple of other questions, just on staying with Hezbollah, um, the Israelis have presented a narrative which goes something like, we are rescuing we are rescuing Lebanon from Hezbollah. Lebanon lost its sovereignty. We are giving the Lebanese back their sovereignty from Hezbollah. Um, and you spoke a lot about how Hezbollah has penetrated deep into Lebanese society, has legitimacy. I mean, so what
Well,
do you make
it
of?
is part of Lebanese society,
Yeah.
so it
So,
hasn't
so
really penetrated it.
yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I
Mm.
should rephrase that. So, what do you make of the Israeli narrative then? I mean, they use the same playbook with Gaza as well. How we are doing the Palestinians a favor uh, by eliminating Hamas and giving Palestinians back their freedom. It's the same playbook they seem to be using when it comes to Hezbollah.
Well, it's a playbook that actually goes back decades. I mean, in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon and carried out mass slaughter. If you listen to what the Israelis said, to rescue Lebanon from the PLO. In 1981, Israel directly started attacking Syrian forces in Lebanon in order, in its words, to save Lebanon's Christians from genocide. In the 1970s, Israel was seeking to save the population of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip from the radical insiders of the PLO. This gets back a bit to the earlier part of our discussion. So, of course, an aggressor is always going to present their aggression as the actions of a savior. And Israel has consistently done this for many decades. But here again, there's also, I think, another parallel to be drawn with 1982. Not only was that presented as an effort to save Lebanon from the PLO, and not only was that initially presented as a limited operation to push the PLO several dozen kilometers away from the Lebanese-Israeli border, and not only were we told that the name of the operation was Operation Peace for Galilee, which I think suited Israel's agenda very well. But we quickly found out that the real name of the operation, as devised by Ariel Sharon and his cohorts, was Operation Big Pines. And it was part of a much larger strategic initiative to redraw the map of the Middle East. And I think we're seeing something very similar now. When Netanyahu starts talking about saving the Iranian people from their regime, do you really think he cares, about how oppressed and repressed and violated the Iranian people are by their leaders? No, it's all about redrawing the strategic environment of the Middle East. And I think, given Israel's tactical successes in recent weeks, we may be now entering a phase where, as in 1982, strategic hubris takes over.
I mentioned the US earlier. Washington has or did say that they were not given prior notice that Israel was going to assassinate Hassan Nasrallah. And what do you make of their attempt to distance themselves? I mean, Stephen Walt, an American professor, and I quote him, he said, and this also applies to Gaza. This is pretty simple. If you don't want someone to do something, you don't give them the means to do it. One must therefore conclude the US government does not object to what Israel has been doing over the past year. Of course, he wrote this in response to Hezbollah assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, but of course this also applies to Gaza, as you mentioned. This has been the position of Washington throughout. It criticizes verbal criticism of Netanyahu and issues red lines, but it never ceases arms sale to Israel. And the point is quite strong, I think. If you don't want someone to do something, just don't give them the means to do it. I mean, what do you make of Washington's position in trying to distance themselves from the assassination?
Well, there's two issues here. The first is that the United States repeatedly says that it had absolutely no foreknowledge of these actions and only learned about them when it was so informed by the Israelis. And the second is that the U.S. will then unconditionally support whatever Israel has done, including massive escalations, and immediately thereafter call for restraint and efforts to prevent further escalation. In other words, it throws the ball in the court of others, saying, if you now want to reduce escalation, well, then you have to accept Israeli aggression and not respond to it. Now, regarding the first point, it's it's impossible to take seriously any American claims that they only learned about these Israeli actions when they were informed by the Israelis. I mean, we're being asked to believe that the U.S. is blind, that it has absolutely no idea about what's happening in the Middle East and only learns about it through third parties. It has absolutely no intelligence capabilities of its own. And this is the same United States that for months was warning the world about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and had a very accurate picture of what was happening on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Yet the same United States, which has an extraordinarily close intelligence sharing relationship with Israel, which has the most advanced intelligence capabilities in the world, far in excess of anything that Israel has, both in terms of capabilities and resources and size, supposedly didn't have an inkling of anything Israel is doing and only knows about Israeli activities, only finds out about them during or after the fact, and only because it was informed by the Israelis, because it has no capabilities or resources or intelligence personnel of its own to find out these things. So it's laughable and credible, and I think represents a U.S. effort to distance itself from the consequences of Israel's actions, which, of course, as Professor Stephen Walt points out, are possible only because the U.S. has decided to arm and supply and defend Israel every step of the way.
Yeah, many, of course, are looking to Iran to see what kind of response they will deliver. And what was interesting was some of the statements from the president of Iran, Masoud Peshkian. So he said I think just a few days afterwards, he said that, first of all, he said the assassination will not go unpunished. And then he went on to say that Iran was basically standing down following the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh because the Americans and the Europeans said that this would lead to some kind of a ceasefire. So they stood down for the sake of a ceasefire, but the Americans had lied. Now, having said that, does that also not put the Iranians in a dilemma? First of all,
Yes.
If you're saying the Americans have lied initially, then of course, what's stopping you now from doing something? But it seems like Iran doesn't really want to get drawn into a major war with the Israelis. The president has been signaling that, in my point of view. So, how do you think Iran could respond, may respond, and can it respond?
Well, if the Iranian president genuinely believed U.S. commitments that if Iran did not respond to the Hani assassination in the Iranian capital, the U.S. would then ensure a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. If he believes that, he probably shouldn't be the formal head of state in Iran, and is probably also in a very small minority of Iranian leaders who took these U.S. commitments seriously. But yes, Iran is in a dilemma. Um, if it responds, either a belated response to the Hania assassination or somehow gets directly involved in Israel's rampage through the Middle East, which may well also involve much more comprehensive efforts to expel Iranian forces from Syria. Um, if Iran responds, then it is essentially playing into Israel's hands, and it is helping Israel to provoke a direct military confrontation with Iran, which will then be fought primarily by the US on Israel's behalf. If it responds in in reaction to any Israeli invasion of Lebanon, that will basically be an admission that Hezbollah is incapable of defending Lebanon or even defending itself without Iranian assistance. At the same time, if Iran doesn't respond, it stands to lose significant credibility and being seen as kind of a paper tiger that is very strong on rhetoric, but absent when push comes to shove. I think Iran sees itself and is seen by its coalition partners in the axis of resistance as kind of the strategic reserve, as the member of that coalition, which supplies its partners with weapons, with know-how, and so on. And I think, Iran being a state and having very vulnerable targets, and here I'm not talking about its nuclear program, but ports, oil fields, and so on, um, is not interested in a direct military confrontation with Israel, at least not at this stage. But Israel seems to be pulling out all the stops, just as it has with Hezbollah, to make it impossible for its enemies to continue showing restraint, and therefore to provoke a much larger conflict. My own view is that Iran may choose to respond to these developments by crossing the nuclear threshold, rather than once again firing a whole slew of missiles directly at Israel. But time will tell. I think there are probably people within the Iranian leadership who feel that that this is a conflict that is going to be forced on us if we do not take the initiative, and therefore we should do so now. And there are others who will feel that any initiative by Iran is basically playing Israel's game and should therefore be avoided. But again, at the end of the day, Iran, in a sense, has no good options. It can either play into Israel's hands or lose significant credibility given its stance on these issues.
You mentioned that this could expedite the pace at which Iran acquires nuclear weapon, and that would seem to be the logical conclusion. If your regional allies, proxies, whatever you want to call them, are weakened and cannot defend your interest, then that seems to be the logical conclusion. If that is the logical conclusion Iran draws, if you can see that um, uh, happening, then surely the Israelis can see that happening as well. Does that not also then put Iran in a more difficult scenario where if Israel does not want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, and therefore it may want to just strike Iran and take opportunity of the fact that the US has not restrained Israel. No one has restrained Israel since 7 October. Why not just launch a full front assault on Iran to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons?
That's certainly possible. For example, one can think of a situation where if and when Hezbollah launches a powerful response against Israel for its recent state terror and assassination campaign in Lebanon, that Israel will then hold Iran responsible for this and directly strike Iran, whether from Israel, from its close ally Azerbaijan, across the Iranian border. But ultimately, if you're talking about the destruction of Iran's nuclear facilities, this is not something Israel can do by itself. It requires the capabilities of the United States military to achieve that purpose. And even then, it's unclear whether it would succeed. I think Israel's objective with regards to Iran is not to eliminate its nuclear program. It's to eliminate the regime. In other words, a policy of regime change. And Netanyahu more or less said as much today when he promised the Iranian people he would come to their aid against their own rulers. And I think, the US obviously would like to see regime change in Iran. I don't think the US is prepared to launch such an initiative itself. But particularly in the current context of US domestic politics, this is something that I think Israel firmly believes it can provoke, that it can provoke a direct US Iranian military confrontation, which then opens up the possibility of regime change in Tehran. And given that Israel and the United States see Iran, I think they call it the head of the octopus, they genuinely believe that if you get rid of the Iranian regime, then Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and all these others will rush to embrace Israel because, of course, they don't have any legitimate grievances. They have no problem with Israel. It's just that they're being incited by the mullahs in Tehran to hate Jews, and that's really what this is about.
We've spoken a lot about Hezbollah and Lebanon today, and I think there's a dilemma in Israel, which we've also touched upon, how since its beginning, it's having to assassinate its way through its enemies, one assassination after another, one enemy after another. And I saw two quotes over the past week in understanding why Israel is constantly at a war footing. And feel free to give your comments if you want. But I just wanted to share those quotes, which I found quite insightful in explaining why Israel behaves the way it does. The first was an article by Adam Schutz in the London Review of Books, following
Excellent
the
article.
following the pager attack, terrorist attack on Lebanon by Israel last week. The article itself is called "The Pager Attack." Adam goes on to say, but the line between this is the concluding paragraph. But the line between tactics and strategy may not be so useful in the case of Israel, a state that has been at war since its creation. The identity of the enemies changes. The Arab armies, Nasser, the Egyptian leader, the PLO, Iraq, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas. But the war never ends because Israel's entire existence, its search for what it now brazenly calls living space, is based on a forever war with Palestinians and with whoever happens to support the Palestinian resistance. Of course, in this case, Hezbollah. Escalation may be precisely what Israel seeks or what it is prepared to risk, since it views war as its destiny, if not its raison d'etre. Another was a quote by Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism itself. And I think this goes to the heart of the Zionist project. And here he is defining a nation. And he says, and I quote, "I will give you my definition of a nation, and you can add the adjective Jewish. Nation is, says Herzl, in my mind, an historical group of men of recognizable cohesion held together by a common enemy. Then, if you add to that the word Jewish, you have what I understand to be a Jewish nation." So the logical conclusion was that a Jewish nation is only a nation, according to Zionism, according to Herzl, because of its enemies. So according to Zionist thought, the logical conclusion of that is Zionism requires a steady supply of enemies to justify its very existence. And I think this goes to the heart of what we are speaking about here. Without a steady supply of enemies, according to Zionist thought, then there is no need for the Zionist project. And I thought that quote itself was very illuminating, really underlines why Israel is constantly at war with its neighbors, having to assassinate one leader after another since its existence. So if you don't have a response, Moin, we'll
I
end.
think it's very well put. I've no comment.
Okay, thank you, Moin. And so that was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. And thank you also for tuning in for this week's Memo Weekly Review. See you next week for another review show with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.
Thank you.